Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Crescent International podcast show where we will be examining burning issues through an Islamic paradigm. Our readers know us as the oldest Islamic current affairs magazine. And on the third episode, we're going to be talking about us, Crescent International. It's the story of Crescent International, how it started, how did it begin, how did it become what it is today, and where are we going. Now, with us in the studio, we have a long-time and now former editor-in-chief of Crescent International, Mr. Zafar Bangash. Just before we go on, I'd like to remind some of our listeners and readers who are young. You might not know that Crescent International was started as a community Muslim news magazine in March of 1972 in Toronto. Since then, it became famous as a monthly global news magazine of the Islamic movement, analyzing current affairs within Islamic paradigm. Now, we're mainly covering the Muslim world, being based outside of the Muslim world, because in most of the Muslim world, dictators backed by NATO regimes would eliminate a media outlet like Crescent International. Now, Mr. Bangash, I know that one of the things that Crescent International is known for is that it's a Sunni Islamic magazine, but it's also known for being a staunch supporter of the Islamic revolution in Iran and the Islamic governance system set up in Iran. Now, but we also know the old story, how it almost became a Saudi magazine. So what's the story? Tell us the story.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Yes, it is true that Crescent International has been a very, very staunch supporter of the Islamic revolution in Iran and the Islamic system of governance there. And yes, it is also true that the Saudis tried to buy us out. This was back in 1986. And the way it occurred was that the Saudi ambassador in London at that time, Ghazi al-Qusaybi, happened to be a classmate of Dr. Kaleem Siddiqui. They were both doing their PhDs at University College London, which incidentally is also the college in London University where I studied, and that's where my contact with Dr. Kaleem Siddiqui actually came about. But in 1986, Al-Qusaybi invited Dr. Kaleem Siddiqui for lunch. They said, well, look, we are old friends from our university days. Why don't we get together for lunch, etc.? And during the lunch, as they were having lunch, Al-Qusaybi suggested to Dr. Kaleem, he said, of course, I'm sure that Dr. Kaleem mentioned the difficulties that Crescent was facing or going through. We have always been a shoestring budget magazine. But anyway, Al-Qusaybi suggested to Dr. Kaleem, he said, well, why don't we make an arrangement, make a deal? We will purchase Crescent International for $5 million, and you continue to run the magazine, but we'll just, get the magazine. It'll be owned by us. You continue with your editorials and all the staff that is there, etc., etc. A day or so later, Dr. Kaleem called me and he said, this is what the Saudi ambassador has said. What do you think? I said, Brother Kaleem, I hope that you did not accept his offer, because we wouldn't even sell it for $100 million, let alone $5 million. He said, well, that's exactly what I told him, but I'm glad that you agree with me. Mm-hmm. Because I knew that, what the Saudis do is they go and make these huge offers to people. They buy them off, and then after a while, if they don't like certain things, they could just simply turn around and tell the people, get lost, and then they take it over or shut it down.
Now, Dr. Kaleem back then, why would he, back then I guess Saudis were not so obviously working against the Muslims and the Islamic revival. Why would he, being a Sunni Muslim, why back then would he reject Saudi Arabia?
Well, we are talking about 1986. So we are talking about 7 years into the Islamic Revolution. And of course, even before the Islamic Revolution in Iran occurred, we didn't even know about Imam Khomeini, I'll be very honest. But throughout the year of the revolution, which was 1976 to beginning of 1979, we continued to back the Islamic Revolution full force. I mean, we had no idea who Imam Khomeini is. We had very little contact with Iran, but we felt that this was a genuine Islamic revolution.
How? Why? How?
Because we could see in Imam Khomeini a personality that really resonated with us. And let me give you a little bit of a background. You see, when Dr. Kaleem, I think we need to go into Dr. Kaleem's background a little bit, but Dr. Kaleem basically was the founder of the Muslim Institute in London. And of course, I had a close connection with him. I was a student at University College London or London University. And it was through his ideas and my activism that the Muslim Institute was established. And within the manifesto of the Muslim Institute, which was called the founding document of the Muslim Institute, it was clearly put down that the existing systems in the Muslim world are alien imposed. They are so thoroughly corrupt and so thoroughly alienated from the Muslims that it is impossible to reform these systems, that these systems have to be demolished. Okay, so, and they have to be demolished basically by two groups of people coming together. The ulama, which Brother Kaleem referred to as the traditional sector of the Islamic society, and the modern educated youth that he referred to as the younger generation, that there has to be a fusion of these two forces in society that will bring about change in any Muslim society. And what we witnessed in Iran was, here was Imam Khomeini emerging from the traditional sources of Islam, and in Iran, we saw millions upon millions of young people coming out following Imam Khomeini. And this was actually a realization of our original idea that that's how change would come about in any Islamic Muslim society. And that's why we felt that that was exactly the thing that we were looking for. But of course, Brother Kaleem's hypothesis at that time was that it probably might take us another 50 to 100 years. Whereas, I mean, of course, the Muslim Institute idea germinated back in 1972-73, and within less than 10 years, an Islamic revolution had occurred in a Muslim country. And obviously, we saw our own vision, our own dreams come true, and we had no choice but to support.
But there were people saying like it's Shia Iran, it's conflicting narrative. There is some theological disagreements and so on.
This is the kind of narrow-mindedness and idiotic ideas that some people throw up. Let me give you a little bit of a background. When the Ottomans had their nominal khilafah. Nominal, I mention it nominal because it wasn't really a khilafah, it was a sultanate, or Yet, when there was talk about cancelling the Khilafah or abolishing the Khilafah, the Shias of Iraq stood up in support of the Khilafah. The Shias of Iraq, okay? So in terms of, when we look at the broader picture, I think throughout Islamic history, this whole idea of Shia-Sunni has not really is not really relevant. It is, unfortunately, a recent phenomenon, a recent creation of these Taghuti regimes in the Muslim world, but led by Saudi Arabia, because there was no other way that Saudi Arabia could delegitimize the Islamic revolution in Iran. Before the Islamic revolution in Iran, throughout the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia was looked upon as the leader of the Muslim world. And here was a rival power that emerged, which resonated with Muslims throughout the world, whether they were Sunnis or Shias. In fact, I can say categorically that throughout the year of the Islamic Revolution and after that as well, up to the present time, there are more Sunnis that support the Islamic Revolution than there are Shias in the world. Because unfortunately, many Shias still hold on to these traditional beliefs, etc. They cannot come out of that shell, whereas the Sunnis have no such inhibitions. And when they see an Islamic expression, whether it comes from a Shia background or a Sunni background, it's an Islamic revolution. And that's why we support it.
Now, I know that Dr. Kaleem himself at one point worked as a journalist in London. So when Crescent started operating, like in the age of no internet and so on, I guess his experience was a great contribution.
Oh, absolutely. You see, Dr. Kaleem has a very, very interesting history. Like, as I mentioned, that he was studying for his PhD at University College London in international relations. And that is where I met him in 1972, early 1972. And when we started the idea of the Muslim Institute, or his idea, and my activism, getting students and other, academics together, Dr. Kaleem was at that time doing two jobs. Number one, he was assistant professor at the University of California overseas branch in Germany. He used to fly to Germany to teach over there and then come back to London. And at the same time, he was working with the Guardian newspaper. He was a member of the editorial team of the Guardian newspaper. And so he had both journalistic background as well as academic background. But he was never comfortable in the Western environment. Let me also mention this to you. In the late 60s, when Dr. Kaleem had not yet got his PhD, he was still working towards it, but he was working with the Guardian newspaper and contributing articles, etc. At that time, the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, whom Dr. Kaleem knew very well, Harold Wilson suggested to Dr. Kaleem as to why doesn't he run for the Labour Party as a member of Parliament. Mm-hmm. And of course, Labour Party was in power at the time, it was popular, and Dr. Kaleem rejected that offer because he just wasn't interested in the Western political system. So you can see that his academic background, his journalistic background were both very, very helpful and instrumental in launching the Crescent International into the news magazine of the Islamic movement. And that, of course, occurred in 1980. And again, there is a background to it, and that is that when we established the Muslim Institute, this was, of course, in London, in 1974 I came to Canada, but within our discussion group, we always felt that there should be a magazine or a vehicle for the Muslim Institute. And so when I came to Canada, this magazine, I saw it was a community newspaper and there was very little, fresh input into it. I offered to the magazine that I'm willing to contribute articles. And of course, that was the first time that any original articles had been published in the magazine. So 1974 was the first time that new, fresh articles, original articles started to be published in the magazine.
Now, I know also you yourself, you had to pretty much sacrifice your career. Like, you were an engineer, right?
That is correct, yes. In fact, what happened was that, of course, I had worked as an engineer in England, then I came to Canada. I worked as an engineer here in Canada with a company, a consulting company, and I was earning a lot of money, but back in early 1980, as I said, that's how we got together, myself and Brother Kaleem, because I was going to Pakistan, and on my way I stopped over in London and I spoke to Brother Kaleem, and I told him, I said, look, we had talked in the Muslim Institute that the Muslim Institute should have a vehicle, a journal or a magazine, and here is Crescent International, it's available. Why don't we turn it into something that would serve the broader Muslim Ummah? So Brother Kaleem came here. We sat down with the original the person who had started this magazine. It was officially purchased from him. He was paid, and this Crescent International was taken over. We established a holding company, and it was taken over by this holding company, of which myself and Brother Kaleem and a few other people, including the original founder of Crescent magazine, were directors. And it was at that time, or a little later, that Brother Kaleem said to me that you give up your career in engineering and start working for Crescent full time. I was a little reluctant or hesitant because until that time I was largely financing the Crescent operations from my salary. But Brother Kaleem said, doesn't matter. He said, you don't need to build buildings. I think we need to build civilizations. So you just come over, forget about it. And of course, initially it was very difficult. I mean, I must say that,
many people think like giving up a career and jumping into this sort of activism is just like switching jobs. It's not.
Well, it's not. Of course not, because there was, basically we had to raise our own funds. We had to do all the writing. We had to do all the, marketing of Crescent. And I'll tell you, at that time, Crescent was published twice a month. So what I would do is, for 1 week, I will travel around in the US and other places, giving lectures and urging people to subscribe to the Crescent magazine. Then I'll come back, and 1 week I'd spent on producing the Crescent magazine. Then after that, I'll fly back to the US, mainly US, because Crescent was very popular in American universities, Muslim students, other activists would invite us, etc. And so I'd go on a lecture tour, raising funds and, debating with people, all kinds of sort of things, and sometimes universities would pay some stipend, which obviously went into the Crescent Fund, etc. So that's how we financed it.
That was during no internet and stuff. It must have been hard, difficult to work. I remember you guys had quite a genius way of using a phone service. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, of course. Basically, you see, when you don't have anything, you don't understand what you are missing. So, we acquired our first fax machine back in 1987. And we used to think, my God, how on earth did we manage without a fax machine until then? Because everything had to be written and people had to, mail their articles to us, etc., and whatever we produced. And then in the early 90s, what we did was there were some student activists in the U.S., in Seattle, Washington. And they said, we could set up something whereby, these Crescent news stories can be, even short ones can be broadcast from on the phone, and people can call in and listen to it. So we said, that's fine. So basically, we set up two arrangements, one in Seattle, Washington, and the other in Toronto. So I would type every day. I would type a few stories. It's very brief, maybe 4 or 5 stories, and I will email to these brothers, and they would print them out, and then they will record them and put them on the phone line. So people would call into the phone line. Mm-hmm. So just like you have phone messages, people would call in and they would listen to the stories. And of course, at that time, probably we were the only phone-in news service that was Islamically oriented. So this was a novel idea, and people were, really interested in it.
Now, some people also say, what do you mean Islamic news magazine? How can news be Islamic and so on? Like, what would you say to that?
Well, very simple. I mean, there is, obviously, everybody has their own perspective. And we look at events and see how these fit into the Islamic paradigm. So, for instance, when one looks at what happened in Iran. It was a lot of the people, those that don't accept the Islamic sort of paradigm, they would say, well, it was an Iranian revolution. But we categorically reject that, because we say that it would be an Iranian revolution if it's a nationalistic revolution. But it was not a nationalistic revolution. It was an Islamic revolution. Another very good example is what happened in Palestine. For decades, the Palestinian struggle was in the hands of secular nationalist Palestinians. There was no Islamic movement in Palestine until it emerged in 1987, at the end of 1987, with the first intifada in Palestine, when Islamic Jihad emerged. And Hamas existed, but they were totally non-political. Then, of course, Hamas also became political. So now you see in Palestine an Islamic movement comprising of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and you see the secular Palestinian nationalistic movement identified or represented by the Palestinian Authority. And you can clearly see the difference. The Palestinian Authority is composed of puppets of the Americans and the Zionists. They are their agents. And even they have now come to the end of their line when they've realized that, whatever they were trying, they were ultimately betrayed by the very people that were telling them, no, we are going to look after your interests.
Now, I know also Crescent's people who write and work with Crescent are also big on using particular terms and terminology, right? I know that, for example, we Crescent have an issue with some media using a term, for example, when describing the office of guardian jurist of Wilayat Faqih as supreme leader. And we're very particular about terminology. Why is Crescent from its early days, and I know you've mentioned a few times, Dr. Kaleem was paying a lot of attention to this. Why pay so much attention to terms and words?
It's extremely important because all these terms carry certain connotations. You see, the supreme leader idea comes from countries like North Korea or China, etc. It is not rooted in Islam. Whereas we have our own terminology, and that's why you would see in the Crescent International, we always refer to Imam Khomeini as Imam Khomeini, not Ayatollah Khomeini, and even to the Rahbar we refer to him as Imam Khamenei, not Ayatollah Khamenei, which unfortunately even in Iran there are certain media outlets that do this. We believe that the leader of an Islamic state is an imam. He is the leader of the entire Muslim ummah. Regardless of whether he is Shia or Sunni, it doesn't matter. Once there is an Islamic state, and there is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about this, that a Muslim should either live in an Islamic state or strive to establish one. And if he doesn't do either of these two, he dies the death of Jahiliyyah. So if we have an Islamic state, which we believe the Islamic Republic of Iran is an Islamic state, and its leader, therefore, is the Imam. And that's why Brother Kaleem and us, we have always been very clear. And in fact, you would see that we try very hard not to use terms like nation or nation state. We, in fact, repudiate them because we believe that nation and nation states are Western concepts that have been imposed on our societies. The same thing applies to political parties. Brother Kaleem was very, very clear about this issue. In fact, he had written in the early days of the Islamic Revolution when there were political parties in Iran, and Brother Kaleem wrote extensively against them. And then, of course, within a couple of years, Imam Khomeini abolished the political parties. There used to be the Islamic Republican Party in Iran, which, of course, was led by the ulama, but Imam Khomeini banned all the political parties. So today, you don't have political parties in Iran. We have political trends, of course. You have the principalists, the reformists, whatever, but you don't have political parties.
I see. Also, one of the things is that you did some war correspondence during the Saddam-Iran war. What was that like? I mean, it was a bloody war.
Of course, that war started in September of 1980 and lasted until almost the end of August 1988. And of course, during the war years, I went to Iran several times. My first visit was in 1982, beginning of 1982. I went to the province of Ahvaz, which was the front line with the Iraqi forces. And we went all the way up to a town called Shush. And of course, it was devastated, completely devastated. I mean, there was not a single house in Shush that was left intact. And there were massive big holes in the walls and the shutters and everything. I mean, there must have been massive fire directed at them. Of course, the Iranians had recovered it by then. But the Iraqi army was only about maybe a couple of miles away from there when we visited the war front. And also in Shush, there is a grave of this biblical prophet Daniel. I went to visit it. I took photographs there, and then, of course, 2 years later, when I was visiting Iran again, and of course, I was with Brother Kaleem, we were staying in a hotel, and all of a sudden, there is this bombing raid by the Iraqi Air Force. And we were, sharing a room. Brother Kaleem said, "Zafar, wake up, there's an air raid." I said, "Really, Brother Kaleem, what's happening?" So we got up. Of course, it's pitch black. The lights are turned off, and you look at the sky. There is anti-aircraft fire, and the planes are sort of whizzing around. And in the morning, of course, we heard this bomb explosions, etc. Our hotel room shook. In the morning, when we inquired, we found out that they had dropped their bombs about a couple of miles away from where we were staying. And some residential areas had been hit, and about 37 people had been killed. So there was sort of, that situation. And then, of course, we had one of our correspondents who was reporting he was an Iranian brother. He was reporting from Majnoon Island, and he was hit by chemical weapons by the Iraqis, and of course he passed away as a consequence. So there have been many stories like these that we have encountered.
Now, I also know that you witnessed the massacre at Haramain in what year?
87.
87. You were there when the Saudi forces massacred the peaceful pilgrims. Now, what I and many others didn't know was that this march was agreed upon with the Saudi officials, and yet still this massacre took place. So what happened then?
Yeah. Basically, Imam Khomeini announced that when Muslims go for Hajj, they must fulfill this Quranic commandment, which is referred to as Bara'atum min al-Mushrikeen. This is Surah Tawbah, beginning ayat of Surah Tawbah. And I think our listeners should understand that these ayats were revealed in the 9th year of the Hijrah of the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's mission when he was in Medina. And at that time, the Hajj caravan of Muslims had led for Hajj, led by Abu Bakr Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu. And when these ayats were revealed, the Prophet ﷺ did not wait until these Muslims came back to Medina. He immediately sent his son-in-law, Imam Ali Karamallahu Wajhu, to say, go to Makkah and proclaim these ayat at the time of Hajj. So number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals these ayats in the month of Zulhijjah. Secondly, the Prophet ﷺ instructs his own son-in-law, Imam Ali, to go to Makkah and proclaim these ayats at the time of Hajj. So that means that this is a divine command. And Imam Khomeini revived it because he said that this is a divine obligation that we have to fulfill. And so every year, starting from 1980, the Iranian pilgrims and others, Muslims who were conscientious, would participate in this march. And of course, the Iranians always made sure that they coordinate their march with the Saudi authorities. They would go over it. So in 1987 also, the Iranian brothers who were in charge of arranging the Iranian pilgrims and the march, etc., they had walked with the Saudi authorities throughout the entire route that the marchers would take in Makkah. And they were going to stop about 2 kilometers short of the Haram. That was all agreed upon. In fact, along the route, they had even run their wires, etc., for sound and speakers, etc., etc. And yet, on that particular day, it was a Friday, I had gone for Hajj with my mother. And the night before that, we went to the Haram early in the morning, around 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. We thought that, since it's going to get crowded, so the best thing is that we go there very early. We'll be there all the time. We'll not only pray our Fajr prayers, but Jummah prayers as well. And then we come back and, have our lunch, and then I will join the rally. Now, when we came out of the Haram, around 1:30 or so, and the march was going to start about 3:30, 4 o'clock, because it's very hot. It was July 31st, by the way. What I really was shocked to see was that there were so many Saudi soldiers over there. I mean, there were military trucks, and when I looked at the buildings, there were sharp shooters on the buildings, top of buildings, with big guns and so on, and telescopes, etc. I said, this. It gave me a very eerie feeling. I said, this is unbelievable. I mean, what are all these soldiers doing over here? But I thought, maybe the Saudis are nervous or whatever. But anyway, when the march started, and there were probably, I must say there probably been hundreds of thousands of marches, hundreds. And they were, it had started from a place called Azizia. And Azizia was the place where I was staying, or we were staying.
There were rooms that the pilgrims were trying to take over Mecca. Now, Kaaba or something, Haramain, you were there. Was there anything of this sort of happen?
Absolutely not. Basically, when in the march, the way the Iranians had arranged it was that at the front they had these war wounded in wheelchairs, okay, and immediately to the side of them were women. Now, if you want to take the Haram, you wouldn't be sending your handicapped people and women in front. You'd be sending some muscular people to sort of confront them. But there was no such thing. Secondly, the Haram was several kilometers away, and this march was basically stopped at a place called Junoon Bridge. And there is, of course, right next to it, Junoon Bridge in Makkah is Masjid-e-Jinn. And it was there that it was blocked. They were prevented from moving forward. Now, of course, imagine hundreds of thousands of people at the back don't even know, they are still moving forward, and here are the Saudis that have blocked the thing. And of course, the organizers went forward. They told the Saudis that, you can't stop us here. We still have another, a kilometer or so to go, and then we will disperse as we have done in the past. Yet the Saudis refused, and then not only did they refuse, but they started throwing stones from top of the bridge on these handicapped people and on women, and then they also started shooting at them. I mean, they were actually firing at them. And of course, in that, naturally, now you imagine, people are being fired upon, so obviously they have to start running back. There is no way to go. You cannot come back because there are hundreds of thousands of people coming behind you. And there are people coming from there. They don't know what is happening. And so when the shooting started, when the stone was being dropped at people, ultimately when the whole thing ended late night, because there were ambulances running all the time, and I personally picked up these injured and wounded people. I mean, my clothes were full of blood, And when my mother saw it, because my mother was also with me, she got terrified. She thought I had been wounded. I told her, I said, no, alhamdulillah, I'm okay. I'm not wounded. But I mean, obviously, these are elderly people that have been, hit by clubs and stones, and they are, bleeding. And we had to, pick them up and bring them to our building and clean them up and try to put bandages on them, etc. And the next day we learned that more than 400 Iranian pilgrims had been martyred in Makkah. Imagine the place where it is forbidden to even carry weapons, yet the Saudis perpetrated this massacre. And, then later on we learned that there was a German paratroop general. His name was General Wagner, who had been brought in to Makkah several months before the massacre actually took place, and he coordinated this entire operation. So the Saudis are guilty of many crimes. Number one, you cannot bring non-Muslims into Makkah. It is forbidden. And especially non-Muslims who come with the intent to kill Muslims. So the Saudis are guilty. That's the first crime. Secondly, you cannot carry guns in Makkah. It is forbidden. The Prophet ﷺ forbid that. It has never happened in the history that people would come and they would be carrying guns in Makkah. Number three, you carry out a massacre of pilgrims. Every which way you look at it, it's a violation of every Islamic commandment that the Saudis perpetrated over there.
I see. Yeah. In terms of some of the key milestones of coverage of Crescent, and I'm going to start with the most recent and the controversial one. That is Syria. I know that when the events in Syria started, many people within Crescent International were pushing Crescent Magazine's editorial board to support the revolution in Syria within Crescent. Now, what happened with that? How did the editorial board realize and took the unpopular position?
Well, basically, whenever we look at a situation, we look at it from the point of view of whether that situation is going to help or hinder Muslims. And although we are no fans of Bashar al-Assad or the Ba'athist regime in Syria or whatever, but we have always taken the position that it is not for outsiders to determine who rules in a particular country. So to give you an example, if, for instance, today, the Americans come and they want to overthrow the government in Saudi Arabia. Although we hate the government in Saudi Arabia, the regime in Saudi Arabia, we would still oppose that American attempt because we'll say it is none of your business. It is for the people of the Arabian Peninsula and for Muslims at large to decide. So we took that position and we said that what is happening in Syria is a foreign instigated conspiracy meant to undermine another Muslim country so that the Americans and the imperialists and Zionists can impose a regime of their liking. I mean, look at the situation in Libya, for instance, the mess that they have created over there. The Americans tried to do it in Afghanistan. They miserably failed. They put up a puppet government, but after 18 years, they've realized that they couldn't do it. Iraq, fortunately, managed to escape from that in the sense that since Iran is a next-door neighbor, Iran was able to turn the situation around in Iraq so that the overthrow of Saddam's regime. Incidentally, we were absolutely opposed to Saddam Hussein. We never spared him because he was such a criminal. But even there, we were not in favor of Americans invading Iraq. And many Iraqi brothers were opposed to us because of that. But we said, no, if you do that, you become a puppet of the Americans, and that is unacceptable.
Now, I also know that another milestone was Algeria. When the elections in Algeria happened. What happened with that?
Yeah, in fact, even before that, let me tell you, back in May of 1991, the Algerian elections took place in December of 1991. We wrote an editorial in the Crescent, and I said that three things are possible. Number one, the Islamic Salvation Front, which had won elections at the local level, I said that either they would not be allowed to participate in the elections, and if they are allowed to participate in the elections, the Algerian establishment is likely to rig the boundaries and the elections so that the Islamic Salvation Front would be deprived of electoral victory at the state level. And I said, even if these two scenarios do not occur and the Islamic Salvation Front wins the elections, they would still not allow them to take over power. In fact, the military would be unleashed against them and they would be massacred. And that's exactly what happened 7 months later. Mm-hmm. Now, Of course, even when the elections happened and the Islamic Salvation Front won, I want to share this episode with you. I was in Chicago attending a Palestinian conference. This was December 26th. And there, these big leaders of Islamic movements and others from Palestine and other countries, they were all there, and everybody shouting, Allahu Akbar, we have won the election, we have an Islamic government in Algeria. When it was my turn to speak, I said, brothers, please wait. With all due deference to all of these great scholars, I would urge that you don't start celebrating yet. I said, just wait, look for statements coming out of London, from Paris, and from Washington, D.C. And then you will know whether our brothers of the Islamic Salvation Front would be able to establish a government in Algeria. And immediately after that conference, I had to go to London, England, because the Muslim Parliament was about to open. This was going to be opening on January the 4th and 5th. So Brother Kaleem had asked me to go there so that, I can help with the arrangements, etc. And on January the 5th, in the Sunday Times of London, there was a headline news which said that we have learned from intelligence sources that Saddam Hussein has been providing nuclear know-how to Algeria. And I told everyone, I said, look, this is the attempt that they are going to crush Algeria now, because they are now trying to link Algeria with this nuclear, program. I said, there is no nuclear program in Algeria. And this was the setup, this was the propaganda that they wanted to launch with a so-called respectable newspaper like the Sunday Times of London. And so our reading of the situation was that they would simply not allow another Islamic government to emerge. Because I knew that the experience they had with the Islamic Republic of Iran, they were not prepared to allow another Islamic government to emerge in the Muslim world. That's unfortunately what happened.
Now, also that we know, is that the reason why Crescent was a bit skeptical of the Arab Spring? Like, I remember reading in Crescent that it said Arab Spring or the Islamic awakening was a natural process that was subverted into a project. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. You see, the thing is that in virtually every Muslim country, and particularly in the Middle East, the masses are fed up with their rulers. There is oppression, there is tyranny, there is all kinds of corruption, every mismanagement, you name it, and the negative things that exist over there. And the people were absolutely genuine in their desire for change. But the problem with that was that, number one, they had no leadership. And number two, almost all of these movements, or at least their leadership, whatever it was linked with outside powers. And we knew immediately that it will not succeed. This will turn into a project, that this will turn basically, these uprisings turned into a safety valve, a relief valve to release the pent-up energy, anger of the people, and then go in and crush them. And the prime example of that was Egypt. What happened? Hosni Mubarak, a tyrant for 30 years, overthrown after 3 weeks, and yet after a short interlude of the Morsi government, the same military came back, and we were also very critical of Morsi because we said, look, or his group, that you're operating in the existing system. It will not allow you to function. The judiciary is in their hands, the security things are in their hands, the military is in their hands. You have nothing under your control. You are just a figurehead over there. Even if you try to appease them, they will not allow you. And that's exactly what happened, unfortunately. So they lasted less than a year. They were overthrown, and imagine the terrible, terrible suffering that has been inflicted on the Ikhwan by the Egyptian military, etc.
Now, recently, some of the readers on social media and so on pointed out that Crescent was recently talking about and analyzing the situation in Central Asia and the revival of the pipeline geopolitics there. Then we had Pompeo go visit, and then you suddenly had clashes between ethnic Kazakhs and Chinese ethnic Muslims come out of nowhere.
Yes, of course. This is exactly how the Americans and the imperialists operate, that they are able to instigate clashes and conflicts in society between different groups. And then they sort of try to present that as something that is happening naturally, when in fact there were never any clashes among these ethnic Chinese and Kazakhs in the past. But this was all geared towards this pipeline business that the Americans did not want. And so this was a warning to the ruling elite in Kazakhstan that either you do what we tell you or you're going to face these consequences. And this incidentally also happened in Syria, because there was also the pipeline issue involved in Syria, which Syria was not prepared to accept what the Americans and the others wanted. And so that is how they went in. But Syria is even more important in the sense that the destabilization of Syria also has to do with protecting Israel. And so there are a whole lot of issues involved in Syria. And I'm glad that, not that I'm in favor of the Syrian government, but at least to their credit, despite all of the pressure, that the Syrian government, especially Bashar al-Assad, has not caved into that pressure and dissociated himself from the Islamic Republic, although he was offered, the Americans offered him and the Israelis offered him that if you cut off your links with Iran, that we can return the Golan Heights to you. And he refused that. Although within his government there were elements that wanted to take that opportunity, but he said Iran has supported us all this time. We cannot and should not betray them. And so at least I'm glad that he has stood up for something, some principle.
Now also that we know the Crescent is big about discussing how Mecca and Medina should not belong to a nation state. It should be an international city. Is that idea somehow becoming popular among Muslim circles?
Yes, I think it is, and we have talked about it, or written about it extensively, because Mecca and Medina do not belong to the Saudi family. I mean, the whole notion of calling the Arabian Peninsula Saudi Arabia is shirk, because it suggests that somehow that land belongs to this family, when we know that, the whole world, everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first point. Secondly, the Saudis emerged from Najd. They are Bedouins. They came from central, Arabia. And Mecca and Medina is part of the Hijaz. And Mecca and Medina are referred to collectively as the Haramain, the two harams. And this is the common heritage of the entire Muslim Ummah, because we don't go for Hajj because we like the Saudis. We don't give a damn about the Saudis. We go for Hajj because it's an Islamic obligation. We go for Umrah because it's an Islamic obligation. And then we visit the Masjid al-Nabawi because the Prophet ﷺ told us that, you should visit these two mosques as part of your pilgrimage performance. So Makkah and Medina have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. And in fact, they have grossly mismanaged this whole thing. They have turned it into an elitist experience. Today, it is so expensive to perform Hajj. It costs in North America something like $12,000 per person. That's obscene. Now, Hajj should be within the means of an average Muslim. It is not. It is not an elitist exercise. The Saudis have also imposed visa restrictions that, only 1% of Muslims can come over there for each year. If you look at the 2 billion Muslims, that means a person has to live for about 1,000 years before his or her chance would come to perform.
Do you think this idea is picking up, though, that Mecca and Medina should become an international city?
I think among the enlightened people, this is definitely gaining currency, although I would say, unfortunately, that among rank-and-file Muslims, they are not really too much involved in it. They are simply concerned about being able to perform their Hajj and Umrah and then go home, which again is a violation of the Quranic command, because the Quran says, Al-Hajju Ashhurum Ma'lumat, that Hajj is in the well-known months. It doesn't say it's a few days or 1 or 2 weeks. And so Muslims are not really tuned in or plugged into the message of the Quran. That's why they miss out on these things.
Now, in terms of moving forward, what are some of the issues that Crescent is going to be looking forward, with the new editorial board and so on? What are some issues to focus on?
Well, basically, as you said in your introduction, Crescent International has always focused on issues that affect the Muslim world. And obviously, it's for the new editorial board to decide. But I don't anticipate that there will be any major change in direction. I think things that are happening in Saudi Arabia right now, for instance, there is total turmoil. And incidentally, I had written a book about, Saudi Arabia. This was published at the beginning of 2015, and the title of the book was The Doomed Kingdom of the House of Saud. And I made certain projections, I wouldn't say predictions, but projections, that there is going to be turmoil, because once the older generation sort of shuffles to their grave, then the new generation that's going to take over, there's going to be, tussle over power. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. I didn't know who was going to emerge as a crown prince or whatever, but without naming an individual, we just looked at the process. We looked at the trends. And based on those trends, we could see that there will be conflict in society, and that's what we are witnessing today. In fact, in Saudi Arabia, there is great turmoil right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is sort of, clashes that would erupt within the kingdom.
Do you think also maybe expand into other areas like Kashmir, economics, and other areas?
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, the Muslim world is full of problems. Kashmir has been going on for more than 7 decades. These people have been struggling for their rights. And we have a fascist regime in India that is suppressing them violently. Then we have the issue of Palestine, which again, has been in turmoil for 7 decades. The Palestinian rights are being trampled upon. We see this war going on in Yemen, which the Saudis have lost. And of course, now we see this, the coronavirus, the economic warfare, crash of the oil prices, etc. All of these things are going to impact, and they will impact on the Muslims much more than other countries because Muslims are not properly organized.
And also, in conclusion, I'd like to mention to our listeners that next year, right, Crescent is 50 years old.
That's correct. Yes, we will. It's incredible that today we are the only international Islamic magazine left in the world. In the past, there were others, Saudi financed, other countries financed, whatever. They all collapsed because they were top heavy. That means that they had too many people on top, giving them huge salaries, living in huge buildings. We are the common man's magazine. We live right at the ground floor. We live at minimum budget. We spend long hours, sacrifice a lot. We don't draw massive salaries. And next year, inshallah, we would be completing our 50 years. And that's a milestone in the life of any Islamic magazine. No Islamic magazine survives today except Crescent International.
Great. From what you've mentioned earlier, there are some ideas to hold a conference, a sort of like a study group kind of conference, a seminar. So I guess if our listeners want to donate and contribute, they can do that through the website?
Oh, absolutely, yes. They can go to the website, and I'm sure the new editorial board would be very happy to receive their donation.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and I hope that this has been helpful for our listeners to get a sense of the history of Crescent International, and I hope, inshallah, that the new team of Crescent International will continue to do the work that we have been doing for the last 49 years.